Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are names in the history of the Imperium of man that carry the weight of entire civilizations behind them. Names that, when spoken aloud, call to mind images of impossible battles, of worlds set ablaze, of empires raised from the ashes of darkness. Some of these names belong to conquerors, others belong to saints. A rare few belong to something that defies easy classification, something between a god and a man, between a weapon and a father, between a legend and a living memory. One such name is Lion L. Johnson. Say it slowly, and let the syllables settle over you like the sound of wind moving through ancient trees. The lion, son of the forest, the first, the Primaris, Angelus Mortis, the first angel of death, master of the dark angels, Lord Protector of Imperium Secundus, the Knight of Nihilus. Yet he has carried many titles across the span of millennia, and each one tells a piece of a story so vast, so deeply layered with tragedy and triumph and betrayal and redemption, that it could fill a library with its telling. But tonight, we are going to tell it all. Every piece, every shadow, every sword stroke and whispered secret. Of all the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind in his subterranean gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient terror, Lion L. Johnson holds a distinction that no other can claim. He was the first. Not the first discovered, not the first to lead armies, not the first to win great victories in the Emperor's name, but the first created. The very template from which all others would be measured. His gene seed was the foundation, the blueprint, or the original draft of what a Primarch was meant to be. And in many ways, the lion embodied that role with a cold, uncompromising perfection that both inspired and unsettled those who knew him. Where his brother Horus Lupercal was charismatic and warm, drawing loyalty through the sheer magnetism of his personality, the lion drew loyalty through something entirely different. He did not inspire through words or smiles or brotherly embraces. He inspired through action, through the relentless, almost mechanical precision of his strategic mind, through the absolute certainty with which he moved through a galaxy that seemed designed to confound certainty at every turn. Standing in the presence of Lion L. Johnson was not like standing in the light of a warming sun. It was like standing in the shadow of a mountain, ancient and immovable, and feeling the undeniable reality that the mountain would still be standing long after everything else had crumbled to dust. His story is one of the most complex in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is a story of a feral child who clawed his way to civilization with nothing but bare hands and an inhuman will to survive. It is a story of friendship, forged in the fires of a dying world, and shattered by the slow poison of jealousy and resentment. It is a story of wars fought across the breadth of a galaxy, of brothers turning against brothers, of an entire planet torn apart by the clash between loyalty and corruption. And it is a story of a long, long sleep in the darkness beneath the stone, a sleep that lasted 10,000 years, until the galaxy's need grew so desperate that even the dead were called upon to rise. This is the story of the lion. And it begins, as all the best stories do, in a forest. Not just any forest, mind you. Not the kind of forest you might picture when you close your eyes and think of tall trees and dappled sunlight and the peaceful sound of birds calling to one another through the canopy. No, the forests of Caliban were something else entirely. They were places where the sunlight never reached the ground, where the canopy above was so thick and so ancient that it created a permanent twilight below, a world of shadow and silence and sudden, terrible violence. The trees themselves grew to such monstrous proportions that their roots could swallow entire buildings, their trunks rising like the columns of some forgotten cathedral, built by gods who had long since abandoned their creation. And in the spaces between those trees, in the lightless hollows and the hidden grottos and the winding passages, where the undergrowth pressed in so thick that a man could barely move. Things lived. Things that had no right to exist in any natural order of life. Things that had been twisted and warped and mutated by forces that the people of Caliban could not understand, could not name, could barely even conceive of. They called them the great beasts. And that is where we must begin, on a world called Caliban, in the age before the Imperium found it, when humanity lived in small clusters of civilization, surrounded on all sides by a darkness that wanted nothing more than to consume them entirely. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the sound of my voice carry you across the stars and back through the ages, and to a time when the galaxy was younger and its heroes had not yet been broken by the weight of what was to come. Let us walk together into the forest and find the child who would become the lion. The world that shaped a Primarch. To understand Lion L. Johnson, you first have to understand Caliban. You cannot separate the man from the world that made him, because Caliban did not simply raise the lion. It forged him. It hammered him on the anvil of survival and quenched him in the cold waters of absolute isolation. And what emerged from that process was something that even the emperor of mankind had not entirely anticipated. Caliban sat in the northern reaches of what would one day become the segmentum obscurus, that vast swath of the galaxy that stretches toward the Eye of Terror. As that great wound in the fabric of reality where the immaterium bleeds through into the material universe. And Caliban's proximity to that wound was not a coincidence. It was, in many ways, the defining characteristic of the entire world. The planet was classified, in the cold, taxonomic language of imperial cartographers, as a death world. But that term, accurate as it may be, fails to capture the particular quality of menace that Caliban possessed. Plenty of worlds in the galaxy are dangerous. Plenty of worlds will kill the unwary through extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, predatory wildlife, or unstable geology. Caliban's danger was different. It was personal. It was malevolent. The forests that covered the vast majority of its surface were not simply hostile. They were actively, consciously predatory, as if the planet itself had developed a hunger for human life and spent every moment of every day devising new ways to satisfy it. This was because Caliban was tainted by chaos. Not in the overt, spectacular way that a demon world might be tainted, with reality itself bending and warping into impossible geometries, and the sky burning with unnatural colors. Caliban's corruption was subtler than that, more insidious, the kind of corruption that works its way into the very roots of things and changes them from the inside out over centuries and millennia. The proximity of the Eye of Terror, and specifically the psychic aftershocks of the birth of the chaos god Slanesh, had seeped into the planet's biosphere like a slow-acting poison, transforming its native wildlife into something that defied natural evolution. The great beasts were the most visible manifestation of this corruption. No two were exactly alike, because the warp does not work in patterns that rational minds can predict. Some were massive, towering predators the size of buildings, all claws and teeth and armored hide. Others were sleek and swift, capable of moving through the forest with a silence that belied their enormous size. Still others were stranger, bearing mutations that seemed to mock the very concept of biological function, extra limbs that moved with independent purpose, sensory organs that could perceive things beyond the visible spectrum, intelligence that went far beyond what any animal should possess. These creatures were the dominant form of life on Caliban, and humanity existed on the planet only by their sufferance, or rather, by their oversight. The human population of Caliban had survived for centuries by retreating behind walls of stone and steel, building fortress monasteries that served as both homes and strongholds, clustered together in communities that were as much military installations as they were settlements. Every structure was built with defense in mind. Every community had its walls, its watchtowers, its armories stocked with the primitive bolt weapons and power armor that had survived from before the age of strife. maintained and handed down from generation to generation like sacred relics. The sounds of Caliban's forests were unlike those of any other world. There was no birdsong, no gentle rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. There was only silence, broken occasionally by sounds that no natural explanation could account for, and a distant crash that might have been a tree falling, or might have been something enormous moving through the brush, a high-pitched keening that might have been the wind through the branches, or might have been a cry of hunger from something that had not fed in days and was growing desperate. Every sound carried the weight of potential lethality. Every moment of silence carried the weight of something choosing not to make a sound. The human settlements of Caliban were built accordingly. They were not cities in any conventional sense. They were fortresses, every one of them, designed from the ground up to resist siege by creatures that could rip through stone walls and shrug off conventional weapons. The architecture was heavy, angular, practical, yet with thick walls and narrow windows and multiple layers of defense between the outer perimeter and the living quarters within. Beauty was a luxury that Caliban could not afford. Every resource, every hour of labor, every spark of creativity was directed toward the single overwhelming goal of survival. The people who lived within these walls were hardy, suspicious, and deeply superstitious. They prayed to whatever deities they remembered from before the age of strife. And they told stories about the forests the way people on other worlds told stories about the ocean, as a vast, unknowable force that could swallow you without a trace and without a warning. Children were taught from birth never to wander beyond the walls. Adults who ventured out did so, armed and armored, moving in groups, watching the tree line with the constant vigilance of prey animals who know that predators are always watching. Travel between settlements was a dangerous undertaking, conducted only when necessary and always under armed escort. Trade was limited. Communication was sporadic. Each fortress community existed in a state of near isolation, connected to its neighbors by roads that were maintained at enormous cost and patrolled by knights who knew that the forest could reclaim cleared ground in a matter of weeks if it was not constantly beaten back. And presiding over these communities, defending them against the constant predation of the great beasts, were the knightly orders. Caliban's society was feudal in the truest sense of the word. Power belonged to the warrior aristocracy, yet the knights who rode out into the forests on their great war horses, clad in their inherited suits of powered plate, carrying weapons that crackled with energy fields and fired explosive bolts. These knights were organized into monastic orders, each with its own fortress monastery, its own traditions, its own territory to defend. They lived by codes of honor that governed every aspect of their existence, from the way they fought to the way they ate, to the way they mourned their dead. The most prestigious activity a knight could undertake was the quest. When a particularly fearsome great beast established itself in a region and began terrorizing the local population, the lord of that territory would declare a quest against the creature, calling upon knights from across Caliban to come and attempt to slay it. Well, to kill a quest beast could bring a knight fame and fortune, the kind of reputation that would follow him for the rest of his days and beyond. But more often than not, questing brought only death. The beasts were ancient and cunning, and for every knight who returned with a trophy, a dozen were dragged screaming into the darkness, never to be seen again. Among these knightly orders, one stood apart. Known simply as the Order, it was unique among Caliban's warrior brotherhoods in one crucial respect. Where other orders drew their membership from the existing aristocracy, selecting knights based on bloodline and inheritance, the Order recruited based on merit. Anyone could join, regardless of birth or station, provided they could demonstrate the skill and courage required. The Order's members were known across Caliban for their honesty, their nobility, and their fearless dedication to protecting the common people. They traveled the planet, moving from community to community, offering their swords wherever they were needed most. And it was a band of these knights, riding through the deep forest on one of their endless quests, who would make the discovery that would change not only Caliban, but the entire galaxy. They found a boy, or rather, they found something that appeared to be a boy, though it was already larger than most grown men and moved through the undergrowth with a speed and ferocity that made even veteran beast slayers hesitate. It was covered in blood, much of it its own, some of it belonging to whatever creature it had most recently killed. Its eyes held the feral intelligence of a predator that had spent its entire life at the top of its own particular food chain. It did not speak. It did not seem to understand speech. It simply stood there in the broken body of a great beast it had apparently killed with its bare hands, and it watched the knights approach with an alertness that suggested it was calculating whether they represented prey, threat, or something it had never encountered before. Several of the knights raised their weapons. They had spent their entire lives fighting the monsters of the forest, and this creature, whatever it was, bore more resemblance to those monsters than to any human being they had ever seen. Better to kill it now, before it could prove itself as dangerous as it appeared. But one knight among them hesitated. His name was Luther, and he was, by all accounts, the greatest hero of his age. Luther was everything a knight of Caliban was supposed to be. He was brave, he was skilled, he was charismatic, and he possessed a gift for oratory that could move even the most hardened warrior to tears or fury. In any other era, Luther would have been remembered as the champion of his generation, the man who defined what it meant to be a knight of Caliban. Luther looked at the blood-soaked figure standing amid the ruins of the great beast, and where his fellows saw a monster, Luther saw something else, something that he could not articulate in the moment, but that he felt with a certainty that went beyond rational thought. This was not a beast. This was something far more significant than any creature of the forest, no matter how terrible. Luther stayed the hands of his brothers. He spoke to the wild figure, slowly, carefully, the way one might speak to a frightened animal, and over the course of hours, he coaxed the creature to approach, to follow, to leave the killing ground of the forest, and accompany them back to the fortress monastery of the Order. And Luther gave the creature a name: Lion L. Johnson. In the Calibanite dialect of Low Gothic, it meant the lion, son of the forest. It was a name given in honor of the circumstances of his discovery, and in recognition of the sheer ferocity that reminded Luther of the Calibanite lion, the most feared and legendary of all the great beasts, a creature so rare and so deadly that only one had ever been killed by a human being in all of recorded history. The Calibanite lion was the apex predator of a world full of apex predators, a beast so fearsome that entire knightly orders had been dedicated to tracking them, and most of those knights had died in the attempt. To name this wild, blood-soaked figure after such a creature was both an acknowledgement of his terrifying nature and a declaration of something more, a belief that this being, whatever he was, possessed a significance that went beyond the merely dangerous. The naming was an act of faith, the kind of faith that only someone like Luther could have mustered in that moment. Most men, confronted with a creature that had just killed a great beast with its bare hands, would have responded with fear. Luther responded with recognition. He saw not a monster but a miracle, and in giving it a name, he claimed it for the human world. Luther could not have known, in that moment, that he was naming a being whose legend would eclipse his own so completely that his own name would be remembered only in the context of what he would eventually become, and what he would eventually do. He could not have known that by reaching out his hand to this feral child, he was setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of his entire world. But that is the nature of tragedy. It begins with an act of kindness. From beast to knight, the young lion L. Johnson was brought to the fortress monastery of the Order, and what followed was one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of any world. The feral child who had survived alone in the most dangerous wilderness in the known galaxy began to learn. Not slowly, not grudgingly, yet not with the halting progress of a normal child coming to terms with language and custom and the thousand small rituals of civilized life. He learned with a speed that bordered on the superhuman, which, of course, it was. Within days, Lionel Johnson was speaking. Within weeks, he was holding conversations with the complexity and nuance of a seasoned orator. Within months, he had absorbed the customs, the laws, the martial traditions, and the strategic doctrines of the Order, with such thoroughness that veteran knights found themselves looking to him for guidance. His mind operated on a level that no human on Caliban had ever encountered, processing information, analyzing patterns, and reaching conclusions with a precision that was almost mechanical in its efficiency. But there was something else about the young lion, something that set him apart from those around him in ways that went beyond his physical superiority and his intellectual prowess. He was, to put it simply, cold, not cruel, not sadistic, not deliberately unkind, just cold. The warmth that exists between people, the easy camaraderie of shared meals and shared jokes and shared stories told around the fire at the end of a long day, these things seemed to puzzle the lion more than anything else in his new world. He understood strategy, he understood the logic of combat, he understood the mathematics of war. What he struggled to understand, what he would always struggle to understand, was the mathematics of the human heart. He himself later admitted that he had difficulty understanding the emotions of others. It was not that he did not possess emotions of his own. He did. But they were buried deep, locked away beneath layers of cold logic and calculated restraint, as if the boy who had survived alone in the forest had learned so thoroughly that vulnerability was a death sentence that he could never entirely unlearn it, even in the safety of civilization. Luther became his guide in this new world, his mentor and his surrogate father. Where the lion was taciturn, Luther was charismatic. Where the lion struggled to connect with the men under his command, Luther could rally them with a single speech. The two formed a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts, each providing what the other lacked, and together they rose through the ranks of the Order with a speed that left their peers breathless. Luther's gift was people. He could read a room the way a hunter reads tracks, in understanding the fears and desires and ambitions of those around him, and knowing exactly which words would move them in the direction he wanted them to go. The lion's gift was war. He could look at a battlefield, whether it was a forest clearing or a fortified position or a vast open plain, and see not just what was there, but what would be there. He could predict the movements of his enemies with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural, positioning his forces with the precision of a master chess player who could see 20 moves ahead. Together, they spread the name of the Order across all of Caliban. The quests they undertook became the stuff of legend, stories told and retold around the fires of 100 fortress monasteries. And as the Order's reputation grew, so did its ranks, whilst as young men and women from across the planet clamored to join the brotherhood that could claim 2 such heroes among its number. It was during this period of rising prominence that Lionel Johnson proposed something that had never been attempted in all of Caliban's recorded history. He called for a grand crusade, a systematic, planet-spanning campaign to exterminate every single great beast on Caliban. Not just the ones that threatened human settlements, not just the ones that had been designated as quest targets by local lords. All of them. Every last one. The idea was revolutionary. For as long as anyone could remember, humanity on Caliban had existed in a state of uneasy equilibrium with the beasts. The knights held the line, pushing back the creatures when they encroached on human territory. But the idea of actually eliminating them entirely was something that most people had never even considered. The beasts were a fact of life, as permanent and as inevitable as the darkness beneath the trees. To suggest that they could be wiped out completely was either the height of ambition or the depth of madness. Luther, wielding his formidable skills of persuasion, convinced the Grand Masters of the other knightly orders to join the crusade. It was Luther's words that brought them together, Luther's passion that overcame their skepticism, Luther's vision of a world free from fear that made them believe the impossible might actually be achievable. But it was the lion who made it real. Over the course of nearly a decade, Lionel Johnson led the combined armies of Caliban's knightly orders on a campaign of extermination. that was as methodical as it was ruthless. He did not fight the way the knights had always fought, riding out on gallant quests to confront individual beasts in single combat. He fought like what he was, a predator who understood predators. He set ambushes at watering holes. He poisoned feeding grounds. He set vast tracts of forest ablaze to drive the creatures into killing zones where massed firepower could cut them down. He gave the enemy no rest, no respite, no sanctuary, hunting them to the last nest and the last den and the last hidden hollow where they might have hoped to survive. It was effective. It was devastatingly, uncompromisingly effective, and it terrified almost as many people as it reassured. The knights who fought under the lion's command spoke of his prowess with fear as much as awe. They had expected a general. What they had gotten was something closer to a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable, driven by a will that did not bend and did not compromise and did not recognize the concept of enough. The lion knew that mercy had no place in this war. To leave the task unfinished, to allow even a remnant of the beast to survive and breed and recover, would be to waste every life spent in its pursuit. There could be only one outcome, and that was total annihilation. Some of Caliban's aristocracy, following the lead of a group called the Knights of Lupus, feared the lion's new methods enough to declare open rebellion. They feared the changes he was bringing to their world, the disruption of a social order that had existed for centuries, the redistribution of power that came with the unification of the knightly orders under a single banner. Some of them had darker reasons for their resistance. The Knights of Lupus, it would later be discovered, had connections to the very chaos corruption that had created the great beasts in the first place. The lion dealt with them as he dealt with all enemies, without mercy, without hesitation, without the slightest flicker of doubt. The rebels were destroyed, their fortresses torn down, their knightly orders dissolved, and their members scattered or killed. When the crusade was over, when the last great beast had been hunted down, and the last rebel stronghold had been reduced to rubble, it was Lionel Johnson who received the honors. And he was proclaimed supreme Grand Master of the Order and ruler of all Caliban. The title was his by right of achievement, by the simple, inarguable fact that he had accomplished what no other person in the planet's history had ever managed. Luther accepted the decision without public complaint. He had fought alongside the lion through every stage of the crusade, had used his oratory to hold the alliance together when disagreements threatened to tear it apart, had risked his life in 100 battles that history would remember, if it remembered them at all, as footnotes to the lion's greater achievements. Luther was gracious about it. He smiled, and he bowed, and he offered his congratulations. But something changed inside him on that day. Something small, something that he might not even have been fully aware of in the moment, but a seed of resentment, planted in the rich soil of a man who had spent his entire life as the greatest hero of his world, only to find that greatness was a relative concept, and that in the shadow of a being like Lionel Johnson, even the brightest star was invisible. That seed would grow. It would grow for decades. It would grow through friendship and through service and through 1,000 acts of loyalty that, from the outside, looked indistinguishable from devotion. It would grow in the secret places of Luther's heart, watered by every casual slight and every unacknowledged sacrifice, and every moment when the lion's cold, uncomprehending gaze passed over the man who had saved his life and given him his name and never quite seemed to see him clearly. And one day it would bear fruit. But that day was still far in the future. For now, as a new dawn was rising on Caliban, and with it came visitors from the stars. The Emperor's arrival and the birth of the Dark Angels. The Emperor of Mankind arrived on Caliban at the head of a force so vast and so technologically advanced that it must have seemed, to the feudal knights of that world, like the arrival of gods. Enormous warships hung in orbit like steel moons, rank upon rank of armored warriors, each one larger and more formidable than any knight of Caliban, deployed to the planet's surface in craft that descended from the sky like falling stars. And among them, though Lionel Johnson could not have known it then, were warriors who carried within their bodies his own genetic legacy, the gene seed of the first Primarch. It cultivated and implanted into human soldiers who had been transformed into something more than human by the science of the Emperor's genolabs. These were the warriors of the First Legion. The First Legion held a distinction among the 20 original Space Marine legions that mirrored the Lion's own distinction among the Primarchs. They were the first, the prototype, the template from which all subsequent legions were derived. Their gene seed was drawn from Lionel Johnson's own genetic code, and it proved to be among the most stable and reliable of all the Primarch gene seeds, producing warriors with an extremely low rate of implantation failure and an even lower rate of mutation. But the First Legion had existed without their Primarch for years, fighting in the Emperor's Great Crusade, that galaxy-spanning campaign to reunite humanity and purge the stars of alien oppressors. They had fought well, but they had also begun to fracture. Without the guiding hand of their genetic father, the Legion had splintered into competing factions and informal warrior lodges called hosts, each clinging to its own particular interpretation of doctrine and tradition. They were effective, but they were not unified. They were powerful, but they lacked the singular purpose that a Primarch could provide. When the Emperor recognized the wild-haired ruler of Caliban as one of his lost sons, the reunion was electric. The Lion felt an immediate connection to the Emperor, a recognition that went beyond words or conscious thought, something written into the very core of his being. This was his father. This was the being who had created him, who had designed every cell of his body and every pathway of his mind with a specific purpose. And that purpose was war. The Lion swore fealty to the Emperor without hesitation. There was no negotiation, no deliberation, no careful weighing of options. In the Emperor, the Lion found something he had never found in any other being, someone whose authority he could accept without reservation. For a man who struggled to connect with others, who found the emotions and motivations of those around him puzzling and often irrational, the Emperor represented something clean and simple and utterly compelling, a cause worth serving.
Now, real quick, I just want to step back from the lore for a second and give you my honest take on the Lion as a character, because I think he gets slept on way too hard on this community. People love Gullyman for being the responsible one. They love Sanguinius for being the tragic angel. You know, they love the Khan for being cool and mysterious, but the Lion, he gets written off as boring and cold. And I genuinely think this is the most unfair read of any Primarch in the entire setting. What I love about the Lion is that his whole story is about a guy who never learned how to connect with people. And instead of the narrative punishing him for it in some shallow way, it actually explores what that costs someone over thousands of years. He is not cold because he does not care. He is cold because the Force taught him that showing vulnerability gets you killed. And the tragedy is that by the time he starts figuring it out, Caliban is gone. Luther has betrayed him and he sleeps for 10,000 years. And then he wakes up and gets a second chance and he actually takes it. That to me is what makes the Lion one of the best written characters in all of 40k. Not the sword fights, not the tactics, not the primal level power. It is the fact that after everything, he chooses to be better. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the story.
The Emperor gave Lionel Johnson command of the First Legion, and the Lion, true to his nature, set about earning the loyalty of his new warriors in the most direct way possible. Yet he challenged the captain of the first company presented before him to single combat. The Lion was unarmored. His opponent wore Terminator plate, the heaviest and most protective armor available to the Legionnaires Astartes. It did not matter. The Lion won the duel, demonstrating in the most immediate and visceral way possible that his authority was not merely ceremonial, it was earned, it was real. It was backed by a martial prowess that even the finest warriors of the Legion could not match. From that day forward, the Lion renamed the First Legion. He called them the Dark Angels, after an old Calibanite myth whose exact origins have been lost to time. The name carried with it echoes of the old world, of Caliban's dark forests and ancient traditions, and it gave the Legion an identity that was distinctly their own, as separate from the clinical nomenclature of imperial military organization. Luther and the other members of the order who were young enough underwent the process of becoming Astartes, the biological transformation that turned ordinary men into superhuman warriors. Those who were too old for the full implantation process, Luther among them, received genetic and biochemical enhancements that elevated their abilities far beyond those of normal humans, though they fell short of true Astartes capability. Luther became the Lion's second-in-command, just as he had been during the crusade against the great beasts. At the council world of Grammari, the Lion took the further step of formalizing the Legion's organizational structure. He dueled the ceremonial council champion, Pirhus Caligat, a master swordsman of formidable reputation, and in a legendary bout that lasted an hour. When it was over and the Lion stood victorious, he accepted the titles of Grand Master of the First Legion and Master of the 6 Wings of the Hexagrammaton, the Death Wing, the Raven Wing, the Dread Wing, the Fire Wing, the Iron Wing, and the Storm Wing. Each wing specialized in a different form of warfare, and the Lion organized them in the style of Caliban's own knightly orders, blending the traditions of his homeworld with the military doctrines of the Imperium to create something new. As the first Primarch, Lion L. Johnson also received the first of the great Gloriana-class battleships, the Invincible Reason. This was a warship of such staggering proportions and firepower that it represented not merely a military asset but a statement of purpose. It was the Emperor's acknowledgement that the Lion and his Dark Angels stood at the pinnacle of the imperial military hierarchy. And then the Lion went to war. The Great Crusade was the most ambitious military campaign in the history of humanity. Across the breadth of the galaxy, the Emperor's forces pushed back the darkness that had swallowed human civilization during the Age of Strife, reclaiming lost colonies, destroying alien empires, and bringing world after world into the expanding dominion of the Imperium. Every Primarch who was discovered was given a legion and sent to the front lines of this vast endeavor, competing with their brothers to bring the greatest number of worlds into compliance with the least expenditure of resources. Lion L. Johnson excelled at this work. His strategic brilliance was matched only by Horus Lupercal, and his tally of military victories was second to none except the War Master-to-be and his Lunar Wolves. The Lion approached the Great Crusade with the same cold, methodical intensity that he had brought to the extermination of Caliban's great beasts. He did not seek glory for its own sake. He did not care about accolades or recognition. He fought because it was his purpose, because the enemies of mankind were, in his mind, simply another form of the beasts that had once threatened Caliban, obstacles to be identified, targeted, and destroyed with maximum efficiency. But it was during the Rangdan genocides that the Lion truly earned his fearsome reputation. The Great Crusade was not simply a military operation. It was, in the truest sense, a war for the soul of humanity. Or every world brought into compliance was a world saved from the darkness that had swallowed human civilization during the Age of Strife. Every alien empire destroyed was a chain broken from around the neck of a species that had been preyed upon for millennia. The Primarchs understood this, each in their own way. Horus understood it as a responsibility. Guilliman understood it as an opportunity. Sanguinius understood it as a calling. The Lion understood it as a hunt. He approached each campaign the way he had approached the extermination of the great beasts on Caliban, methodically, patiently, and with an absolute commitment to total victory. He did not leave enemies behind his lines. He did not accept surrender unless it served a strategic purpose. He did not negotiate with those he deemed unworthy of negotiation, which was most of them. Again, the Lion's campaigns were characterized by their thoroughness, their efficiency, and their stark, uncompromising finality. When the Dark Angels passed through a system, they left nothing behind that could ever threaten the Imperium again. This approach earned the lion admiration and fear in roughly equal measure. His fellow Primarchs respected his results, but were often disturbed by his methods and his demeanor. Jagatai Khan, the great Khan of the White Scars, once observed that speaking with the lion was like speaking with a wall. You could tell it whatever you wanted, but you never knew if it heard you, and you could never be sure it would not fall on you. Rogal Dorn, the stoic master of the Imperial Fists, respected the lion's strategic acumen, but found his secrecy irritating. Even Horus, who of all the Primarchs came closest to understanding the lion, acknowledged that there was a part of his brother that remained permanently beyond reach, a core of absolute isolation that no amount of fraternal bonding could penetrate. The lion, for his part, regarded most of his brothers with a mixture of respect and bafflement. He could appreciate their martial abilities without understanding their emotional motivations. He had no time for Sanguinius's chivalric ideals, for Mortarian's arbitrary hatreds, or for Fulgrim's obsession with beauty. Such passions only obfuscated the true goal, which was the destruction of the enemies of mankind. As the first of all the Primarchs created by the Emperor, he was both more and less than his brothers. A primal force of destruction whose single-minded focus rendered him more inhuman than even Magnus the Red. The lion could stand against any of his kin, match blades with Fulgrim, and stalemate the strategies of Reboot Guilliman. Though some might exceed him in the details of certain tasks, there were none who were his equal in the grander scope of battle, none whose will could match the bloody-minded determination of the lion. His talents and resolute confidence, which some might have called arrogance, won him few friends, but saw him placed at the head of his legion faster than any of the Primarchs who had been rediscovered before him. During the Great Crusade, the lion's fleet sailed to the darkest corners of the galaxy, seeking out the most dangerous enemies and the most desperate situations. Where other Primarchs might have avoided a particular campaign because the odds were unfavorable or the potential costs were too high, the lion was drawn to such conflicts precisely because of their difficulty. He saw in every impossible battle a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be overcome, a beast to be hunted and destroyed. And he solved these puzzles with a consistency that made even his detractors acknowledge his brilliance. The Dark Angels under the lion's command became known as a legion that could do anything. They maintained specialized formations for every conceivable type of warfare, from the lightning-fast cavalry strikes of the Raven Wing to the siege-breaking power of the Iron Wing, from the devastating mass destruction capabilities of the Dreadwing to the infiltration and assassination expertise of the Firewing. And no other legion possessed such breadth of capability, and none could match the Dark Angel's ability to seamlessly transition between different modes of warfare as the situation demanded. This versatility was a reflection of the lion's own mind, a mind that refused to be limited by doctrine or tradition or the comfortable assumption that any single approach to war was sufficient to meet every challenge. The lion studied his enemies with the patient intensity of a predator studying its prey. He learned their patterns, he anticipated their moves, and when he struck with a precision that left no room for error and no possibility of escape. It was this combination of versatility and precision that would serve the lion well in the trials to come. For the Great Crusade was drawing to a close, and in its final days, and the seeds of a conflict that would make all previous wars seem trivial by comparison were already beginning to germinate in the hearts of those who had been charged with bringing light to the galaxy. The Rangdan Xenocides and the fires of the Great Crusade. The Rangdan were a species of such horrifying power and technological sophistication that when they fell upon the northern reaches of the Imperium in the mid-800s of the 30th millennium, it seemed for a time as if the entire Great Crusade might be brought to a crashing halt. The details of the Rangdan conflict remain some of the most heavily redacted records in all of Imperial history. So terrible were the losses sustained, and so dark the methods required to achieve victory. What is known is that the fighting lasted nearly a decade, and that multiple Space Marine legions were committed to the conflict, and that the losses were staggering. The Dark Angels bore the heaviest burden. The First Legion threw itself at the Rangdan with a fury and a determination that was remarkable even by the standards of the Legiones Astartes. The Emperor himself led forces during the initial campaigns, but when Lionel Johnson was discovered on Caliban and brought to the front, the Emperor stepped back and installed the Lion as the overall leader of the war effort. It was the right decision. The Dark Angels who fought during the Rangdan genocide swore that the war would have been lost if not for the presence of their Primarch. The Lion descended upon the Rangdan with a cold fury that was distinctly his own. Not the berserk rage of an Angron or the theatrical wrath of a Leman Russ, but the calculated, implacable advance of a predator who has identified its prey and will not be deterred. In the first desperate years of the conflict, when the Imperium seemed lost in a tide of alien horrors and their enslaved human auxiliaries, the Lion stood tall amid the carnage. He was no golden hero like Sanguinius, nor a dark humid figurehead like Horus. He was a silent rock, unyielding in the storm. He did not inspire loyalty or any other virtue through speech or charisma. He simply went where the fighting was thickest, armored by his pride and his confidence, and others followed him for the simple honor of standing by his side. The Third Rangdan Genocide, around 890 of the 30th millennium, was the climactic engagement. 50,000 Dark Angels gave their lives to prevent the destruction of the entire Northern Imperium. 50,000 warriors, each one carrying the gene seed of the first Primarch, spent in a single campaign to hold back a darkness that threatened to swallow everything humanity had built. The cost was immense. The Dark Angels, who had once been the largest and most powerful of all the Space Marine legions, were devastated by their losses. They would never fully recover from the Rangdan genocides, and the Ultramarines Legion, which had grown to around 166,000 warriors, without having suffered comparable casualties, overtook them as the largest legion. The Dark Angels lost their standing as the preeminent military force of the Imperium, and it is likely that some within the Legion saw this loss of prestige as a failing on the Lion's part. But the Imperium survived, the northern frontier held, and the Great Crusade continued, its momentum restored by the sacrifice of the First Legion and the unyielding will of its Primarch. During this same period, a rivalry formed that would echo through the millennia. On the world of Dulan, the Dark Angels fought alongside the Space Wolves, the 6th Legion, under the command of Primarch Leman Russ. The planetary governor of Dulan had personally insulted Russ, calling him the Emperor's lapdog, and the Wolf King had sworn to take the rebel's head with his own hands. But the Lion had spent days carefully planning a detailed assault on the rebels' headquarters, gathering intelligence and positioning his forces with the painstaking precision that was his hallmark. When the moment came, Russ deviated from the agreed-upon plan, and the Lion moved in and killed the rebel leader himself, denying Russ his oath and completing the campaign with cold efficiency. The aftermath was explosive. Russ stormed into the Lion's command quarters and struck his brother across the face. The two Primarchs then proceeded to wrestle for an entire day and night, neither able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. When they finally broke apart, exhausted and bloodied, Russ looked at the absurdity of two demigods brawling like tavern drunks and burst out laughing. The Lion did not laugh. In what many considered a dishonorable act, he struck Russ across the jaw while the Wolf King was mid-laughter, knocking him unconscious. Russ was carried from the chamber by his men, and by the time he awoke, the Dark Angels had already left the planet. The enmity between the two legions persisted for 10,000 years, and a rivalry rooted in that single moment of misunderstanding and wounded pride. The Space Wolves saw the Lion as cold and treacherous. The Dark Angels saw the Wolves as reckless and undisciplined. Neither side was entirely wrong, and neither side was entirely right, which is usually the way with feuds that last for millennia. But the Lion's reputation as a general was unassailable. Throughout the Great Crusade, he accumulated a record of victories that placed him firmly in the upper echelon of the Primarchs. He was widely regarded as possessing strategic brilliance rivaled only by Horus, and his personal combat skills were among the finest of any of the Emperor's sons. Where Fulgrim was a duelist of peerless elegance, and Angron was a berserker of unmatched ferocity, the Lion was something different. He fought like a hunter, one with the patience of a stalker and the explosive violence of a sprung trap. He was not flashy, he was not dramatic, he was simply, quietly, devastatingly effective. But he was also secretive, deeply, obsessively secretive. The Lion kept his own counsel to a degree that unsettled even his most trusted subordinates, and he shared information with his brother Primarchs only when he deemed it absolutely necessary. This secrecy was not born of malice or deception. It was a product of his upbringing, of those 10 years alone in the forests of Caliban, where keeping silent meant keeping alive, where revealing your position meant inviting attack, and where trust was a luxury that no predator could afford. This quality made the Lion effective. It also made him lonely. And when Horus Lupercal was appointed War Master of the Imperium, and given supreme command of the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence, the Lion accepted the decision with the cold, cynical acknowledgement that Horus had always been their father's favorite. The Lion had secretly believed that such a title might one day fall to him. He was the first, after all, the original, the template. But the Emperor chose Horus, and the Lion buried his disappointment beneath his customary silence. In hindsight, the appointment of Horus as War Master was the first crack in the foundation of everything the Emperor had built. But no one could see that then, not even the Lion, for all his calculating intelligence. The seeds of betrayal. The rupture between the Lion and Luther did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow-growing fracture, deepened by years of small wounds that were never properly healed. Yet the first crack came during the campaign against the alien species known as the Sarosh. While the Dark Angels were conducting operations against these Xenos, the Sarosh managed to smuggle a nuclear device aboard the Invincible Reason, the Lion's flagship. The weapon was intended to assassinate the Primarch, destroying the great ship and its irreplaceable commander in a single devastating stroke. Luther discovered the bomb, and for a long, terrible moment, he hesitated. It was not that Luther wanted the Lion to die, not consciously, not in any way that he would have acknowledged if confronted with the accusation, but in that frozen instant of decision, when the lives of everyone aboard the ship hung in the balance, something dark and honest surfaced in Luther's mind. A whisper of possibility, and a flicker of a world in which the Lion did not exist. A world in which Luther was once again the greatest hero of his age, unburdened by the shadow of a being against whom all his achievements would forever be measured and found wanting. The moment passed. Luther's better nature prevailed. He disabled the bomb, saving the Lion's life and the lives of every soul aboard the Invincible Reason. It was an act of genuine heroism, performed under conditions of extreme danger and personal crisis. But the Lion knew. How the Lion discovered Luther's hesitation remains unclear. Perhaps it was some instinct, some residual sensitivity from his years as a feral child, when the ability to detect deception could mean the difference between life and death. Perhaps one of the librarians, those space marines gifted with psychic ability, had sensed the turmoil in Luther's mind and reported it. Whatever the source, the Lion knew that his oldest friend, his mentor, the man who had given him his name and dragged him from the darkness of the forest into the light of civilization, had wavered, and the Lion, in his cold, uncompromising way, made a decision that would haunt the Dark Angels for 10,000 years. He sent Luther back to Caliban. On the surface, the decision was presented as a practical necessity. Caliban needed to accelerate its recruitment and training of new space marines for the Legion, and who better to oversee this vital task than the Legion's second-in-command? It was a perfectly reasonable assignment, the kind of logistical posting that happened all the time across the various legions. But Luther knew the truth. He was being exiled, sent away from the front lines, away from the glory and the achievement and the brotherhood of the Great Crusade, consigned to a backwater posting on a planet that had already been conquered and pacified. He was being punished for a moment of weakness, a moment that he had ultimately overcome, a moment that by any reasonable standard should have been forgiven and forgotten. With Luther went several hundred other Dark Angels, mostly Calibanite-born warriors who the Lion seemed to want removed from the front lines. Some of these Marines had fought in the forests of Caliban alongside the Lion and Luther in the earliest days. Some had even fought alongside the Emperor himself during the initial Imperial operations on Caliban. Now, they were being sent home to sit out the rest of the Great Crusade, hearing only fragmented reports of their brothers' glorious victories rather than participating in them. For 50 years, the Lion pursued the Great Crusade without ever returning to Caliban or summoning Luther back to his side. 50 years. 50 years of glory won and not shared. 50 years of battles fought and not witnessed. 50 years of a friendship growing cold in the distance between the stars. The Lion, consumed by the demands of the crusade and perhaps unable to fully understand why Luther's exile was causing such damage, simply carried on as he always had, fighting and winning and never looking back. On Caliban, Luther seethed. He managed affairs with the competence and dedication that had always characterized his service, training new recruits and administering the planet with a steady hand. But beneath that steady hand, as something was festering, the resentment that had been planted when the Lion received the title of Supreme Grand Master, the resentment that had been nourished by every unacknowledged sacrifice and every casual slight, was now growing into something that could no longer be contained by duty or loyalty. The isolation of Caliban made everything worse. The planet was far from the front lines of the Great Crusade, far from the centers of imperial power, far from anywhere that mattered in the grand scheme of galactic conquest. The warriors stationed there received only fragmented reports of what was happening in the wider galaxy, and those reports were uniformly galling. Every dispatch brought news of another glorious victory won by their brothers, another world brought into compliance, and another battle honor added to the Dark Angels' already impressive record. And every dispatch reminded them of what they were not doing, what they had been denied, what had been taken from them by a Primarch who seemed to have forgotten their existence. Luther tried, at first, to channel his frustration into productive activity. He threw himself into the work of recruitment and training, building the Dark Angels' reserve forces with the same energy and dedication that he had once brought to the crusade against the great beasts. He established new training programs, expanded the fortress monastery's facilities, and ensured that every warrior who left Caliban for the front lines was as well prepared as he could possibly make them. But it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Because the fundamental problem was not logistical or military. It was personal. Luther had been cast aside by the one person whose opinion mattered to him more than any other, and no amount of busy work could fill the void that the Lion's rejection had opened in his heart. Luther began to read forbidden texts. He studied the lore of the warp, learning things that no loyal servant of the Emperor should have known, things that whispered to him from the margins of ancient chaos tomes, that he had been ordered to destroy, but had instead hidden away. His first act of deception against the Lion, he would later reflect, was not the hesitation over the Sarosh bomb. It was this, the secret preservation of books that he had been explicitly commanded to burn, at the decision to keep knowledge that was dangerous, precisely because it promised answers to questions that loyalty forbade him from asking. He became aware of Caliban's own deep corruption, the warp taint that had created the great beasts, and that still lurked beneath the surface of the planet, waiting. The forests were gone, burned, and cleared during the Lion's crusade, but the corruption that had spawned them was not so easily destroyed. It had seeped into the bedrock itself, into the water table, into the very soil. And Luther, reading his forbidden texts, learned to tap into that corruption, to draw upon its power for purposes that he told himself were defensive, protective, necessary for the security of Caliban and its garrison. He was wrong, of course. The corruption did not serve those who tapped into it. It consumed them. Slowly, imperceptibly, one compromised decision at a time, Luther began to change. The man who had once been the greatest hero of Caliban, the man whose oratory had united a planet and whose courage had saved a Primarch, was being hollowed out from the inside. His principles and his loyalty replaced by something bitter and cold and hungry. Luther also had to deal with political unrest on Caliban itself. The disgruntled nobility of the planet, those aristocrats who had seen their power and their lands confiscated by the Imperium's integration of Caliban into its bureaucratic structure, were chafing under imperial rule. They missed the old ways, the feudal hierarchy that had given them purpose and privilege, and they blamed the lion for destroying it. Luther found himself sympathizing with their complaints, but not because he shared their political views, but because their resentment mirrored his own. They too had been cast aside by the march of progress. They too had been told that their sacrifices were not enough, that the world they had built was inferior to the one being built over its ruins. A cabal of chaos sorcerers also infiltrated Caliban during this period, drawn by the planet's latent corruption and seeing in Luther's growing disillusionment an opportunity to advance the designs of the dark gods. These sorcerers worked subtly, exploiting Luther's paranoia and feeding his suspicions about the lion's intentions. They convinced him that the Emperor knew about Caliban's warp corruption and intended to destroy the planet once its usefulness as a recruitment base was exhausted. They whispered that the lion had known about the corruption all along and had deliberately kept it secret from Luther, leaving him on a doomed world as a kind of slow-motion execution. Whether any of this was true did not matter. What mattered was that Luther believed it. And belief, when combined with resentment and isolation and the slow drip of chaos corruption, was enough to turn even the strongest will toward darkness. And when the Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy, when word reached Caliban that the War Master had turned traitor and was leading a rebellion against the Emperor, Luther saw his opportunity. He declared Caliban's independence from the Imperium, claiming that the lion had betrayed them by abandoning them on this backwater world while the galaxy burned. Yet he gathered to himself those dark angels who shared his resentment, those who felt they had been exiled and forgotten, and he began to prepare for war. It is important to understand that not all of the dark angels on Caliban followed Luther willingly or with full knowledge of what they were doing. Many of the warriors stationed on the planet were unaware of the true nature of Luther's rebellion. They knew that the galaxy was at war. They knew that their Primarch was far away and apparently uninterested in their welfare. They knew that Luther, the man they respected and trusted, was telling them that the lion had betrayed them. And in the absence of any contradicting information, many of them chose to trust the leader who was present over the father who was absent. This is the tragedy of the fallen, or at least some of them. They were not all willing traitors. They were not all servants of chaos. Some of them were simply loyal soldiers who made a choice based on incomplete information. Soldiers who stood with the commander they knew against a Primarch they had never met. Their guilt was real, but it was not absolute. And the lion's decision, 10,000 years later, to pardon those who had not been corrupted by chaos was, in many ways, a long overdue acknowledgement of this complexity. Not against chaos, not against the enemies of the Imperium, against the lion. But the lion did not yet know any of this. He was far away, locked in a war of his own, a war that would test him in ways he had never been tested before. The Thramus Crusade, war against the Night Lords. When the Horus heresy erupted, the Dark Angels were on the far side of the galaxy and engaged in a campaign against a confederation of human worlds and their alien allies known as the Gordian League. This was not a coincidence. Horus Lupercal, in the careful planning that had preceded his rebellion, had deliberately maneuvered the lion and his legion into a position where they could not interfere with his initial moves against the Emperor. When word of Horus's treachery reached the lion, his reaction was characteristically direct. He sought a strategic target that could deny resources to the traitors while simultaneously positioning the Dark Angels for a return to terror. He identified the forge world of Diamat, which housed enormously powerful siege weapons that had been commissioned by the War Master but never collected. The Lion seized Diamat and its arsenal, denying the traitors a critical military asset. But it was here that the Lion made a decision that would later be held against him. A decision that revealed both his strategic genius and his political naivety. He encountered Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors Legion, who was supposedly on his way to join the retaliation against Horus. The Lion, seeing an opportunity, traded some of the siege weapons to Perturabo in exchange for his support in a bid to become the new War Master. The Lion believed that Horus would inevitably be defeated at Istvan, and when that happened, someone would need to take up the mantle of supreme military command. Who better than the first? The tragedy, of course, was that Perturabo was himself a traitor. The Iron Warriors would reveal their true allegiance at the Dropsite Massacre on Istvan V, as turning on their loyalist brothers in one of the most devastating betrayals in the history of the Imperium. The siege weapons that the Lion had so carefully secured ended up in the hands of the very forces they were meant to oppose. The Lion carried the weight of this mistake in silence, as he carried all his burdens. But there was no time for recrimination. Horus had dispatched the Night Lord's Legion under the command of the psychotic Primarch Konrad Kurz to the eastern fringe of the galaxy. The Night Haunter's mission was straightforward: terrorize the loyalist worlds of the region, protect Horus's flanks, and keep the Dark Angels pinned down so they could not reinforce terror. The Night Lords were the perfect tool for this purpose, among all the legions that had turned traitor. They were the most adept at the kind of warfare that could tie down a superior enemy for an extended period. They did not seek decisive engagements. They did not mass their forces for grand battles. Instead, they struck at soft targets, hitting civilian populations and supply lines and communication networks with the ruthless efficiency of predators who understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any bolter or chainsword. Konrad Kurz himself was a nightmare made flesh. Where the Lion was cold and calculating, Kurz was feverish and unstable, a being whose mind had been fractured by an endless torrent of prophetic visions that showed him the very worst of what the future held. He had grown up on Nostromo, a world of perpetual darkness and institutional corruption, and he had learned to fight crime and injustice with methods so extreme that they would have made an inquisitor blanch: murder, mutilation, the theatrical display of corpses arranged as warnings. Kurzi did not simply defeat his enemies. He destroyed their will to resist by showing them, in the most visceral and horrifying way possible, what would happen to them if they continued to oppose him. The Dark Angels, under the Lion's command, were the antithesis of the Night Lords in almost every respect. Where the Night Lords spread chaos and disorder, the Dark Angels brought structure and discipline. Where the Night Lords relied on fear and psychological warfare, the Dark Angels relied on tactical superiority and overwhelming firepower. The two legions were, in many ways, mirror images of each other. And their war in the Thramas sector became a study in contrasting philosophies of combat. What followed was the Thramas Crusade, a grinding, 3-year campaign of warfare that pitted two of the most dangerous legions in the galaxy against each other across a swath of the eastern fringe. The Dark Angels and the Night Lords fought with a ferocity that left entire star systems scarred, their fleets clashing in the void, while their ground forces battled across dozens of worlds. The Night Lords were specialists in terror. Where the Dark Angels fought with cold precision and strategic calculation, the Night Lords fought with cruelty and psychological warfare, spreading fear and panic through the loyalist populations and using the resulting chaos to their tactical advantage. Konrad Kurzi, the Night Haunter, was among the most disturbing of all the Primarchs, a being whose mind was shattered by the constant weight of prophetic visions that showed him the worst possible futures, a being who had descended so far into his own darkness that the line between justice and madness had been erased entirely. 2 years into the campaign, Kurzi invited the Lion to a parley on the world of Tsagualsa. The Night Haunter had left a deep void beacon in the patrol path of one of the Dark Angel's outrider vessels, transmitting coordinates and an invitation to meet face to face. It was a trap, of course. Everything Kurz did was, in some sense, a trap. But the Lion accepted the invitation, driven by a combination of strategic curiosity and the desire to confront his treacherous brother directly. On Segualsa, Kurz revealed a prophecy to the Lion. The exact content of this prophecy has never been fully disclosed, but it concerned the future of the Dark Angels, the fate of Caliban, and events that would not come to pass for centuries or millennia. The Night Haunter, cursed with the ability to see the worst possible outcomes of any situation, took obvious pleasure in dangling these dark visions before his brother, watching the Lion's reaction with the gleeful malice of a child pulling the wings off an insect. The parley ended in violence, as such things always did when Conrad Kurz was involved. The Lion and the Night Haunter fought, and neither could claim a clean victory. Kurz slashed the Lion's throat, a wound that would have killed any normal warrior instantly. In return, Kurz received a sword through his back from the Dark Angel's champion, Corswain, who had intervened to save his Primarch's life. Both sides withdrew, bloodied but unbroken. But the Lion was not finished with Kurz. Using a warp engine of extraordinary power known as the Tuchulcha, an artifact of mysterious origin that allowed the coordination of entire fleets in a single warp jump, the Lion laid a devastating ambush for the Night Lords. The Dark Angels fell upon Kurz's fleet with overwhelming force, shattering it in a single engagement and inflicting casualties that the Night Lords would never recover from. The Lion himself confronted Kurz in single combat once again, and this time the outcome was decisive. He dealt the Night Haunter 11 identifiable wounds, each one instantly fatal to an Astartes. Kurz was rendered comatose, and his shattered legion scattered, yet its cohesion destroyed and its fighting capability reduced to a fraction of what it had been. The Thramas crusade was over. The Lion had won. But the victory had cost him 3 years that he could not afford. 3 years during which Horus had consolidated his forces, broken the loyalist resistance at the Dropsite massacre, and begun his inexorable advance toward Terra and the Emperor. The Lion burned with the need to reach Terra, to bring his legion to bear against the traitors in the defense of humanity's homeworld. But the galaxy itself conspired against him. The Ruin Storm, a vast warp storm of unprecedented scale erected by the Word-Bearer's Legion through dark sorcery, had divided the galaxy in two, cutting off the eastern reaches from Terra and making warp travel all but impossible for loyalist forces. Trapped on the wrong side of an impassable storm, the Lion did what he had always done. He adapted. He looked for a way through. And he found one, though it led him not to Terra, but to a place he had not expected, and a situation he could not have anticipated. During this period of forced displacement, the Lion also made a decision that would have significant consequences for the Dark Angel's culture. Encountering demons during their attempts to navigate the Ruin Storm, the Lion reinstituted the use of librarians, those Astartes who possessed psychic abilities and could wield them as weapons against the enemy. This was a direct violation of the Council of Nicaea, the Great Council where the Emperor himself had decreed that the use of psychic powers by Space Marines was forbidden. The Lion justified his decision on practical grounds, men arguing that in a war against chaos, the weapons of the enemy must be understood and countered, not feared and ignored. Not everyone in the Dark Angels agreed with this decision. When one of the Lion's own officers, the chaplain Nemiel, openly challenged his authority on this point, insisting that the Emperor's decree must be upheld regardless of circumstances, the Lion's response was swift and terrible. He killed Nemiel. It was an act of violence that shocked even the Lion's most loyal followers, but the Lion offered no apology. In his mind, the situation was clear. The enemy used the power of the warp. The Dark Angels needed to counter that power. Anyone who stood in the way of that necessity was an obstacle to be removed. One of the most remarkable moments of this period came when the Lion encountered the greater demon, Kairos Fateweaver, one of the most powerful servants of Tzeentch, the chaos god of sorcery and manipulation. The demon confronted the lion at the height of a battle and attempted to convert him to the service of chaos. It searched the lion's heart, probing for weakness, for doubt, for any crack in his loyalty through which corruption might be introduced. It found nothing. The lion's loyalty to the emperor was absolute, not because it was based on love or gratitude or any of the emotional bonds that connected other Primarchs to their father, but because the lion viewed loyalty as its own reward, a principle that required no justification beyond itself. There was nothing in the lion's heart for the demon to exploit, because the lion did not seek power for its own sake, did not crave recognition or approval, did not harbor the kind of hidden desires and suppressed ambitions that the chaos gods used as leverage against their victims. He was loyal because he chose to be loyal, and that choice was the foundation upon which his entire identity was built. The lion dismissed the Lord of Change by impaling it through the heart with his blade, and reportedly quipped whether the greater demon had foreseen that outcome. It was perhaps the closest the lion ever came to making a joke, and it was characteristic that his idea of humor involved the summary execution of one of the most powerful beings in the warp, an Imperium Secundus, the unremembered empire. The Pharaohs was an ancient alien device on the world of Sotha, a device of staggering power that projected a psychic beacon through the warp, visible to navigators across vast distances. When the Ultramarines Primarch Robut Guilliman activated the Pharos, it became a guiding light for loyalist forces trapped behind the ruin storm, drawing them toward the realm of Ultramar like moths to a flame. The lion, following the light of the Pharos, brought his fleet to Macragge, the heart of Ultramar and the homeworld of the Ultramarines Legion. There he found Guilliman in the midst of an extraordinary project. Believing that Terra had fallen, that the Emperor was dead, and that the Imperium as they had known it was finished, Guilliman had begun the construction of a second Imperium, Imperium Secundus, and the unremembered empire was Guilliman's attempt to preserve as much of humanity's progress and civilization as possible, a desperate gamble to build something new from the ashes of what appeared to be a total defeat. When the lion arrived on Macragge, he greeted Guilliman warmly, a rarity for the notoriously cold Primarch. The two brothers retired to the fortress of Hera, Guilliman's command center, and conferred over the direction of this new Imperium. It was a remarkable moment, two of the most formidable minds in the galaxy sitting across a stone table from each other, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of everything their father had built. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of Sanguinius, the beloved Primarch of the Blood Angels, whose fleet had also been drawn to Ultramar by the light of the Pharaohs. And 3 Primarchs, 3 legions, 3 very different temperaments, all confined to the same corner of the galaxy, with no way to reach Terra, and no certainty that there was anything left to reach it for. Guilliman, to his credit, was reluctant to name himself as the head of Imperium Secundus. He was acutely aware of how such an action would look, how easily it could be misconstrued as a power grab, an echo of the very ambition that had driven Horus to rebellion. Both the Lion and Guilliman agreed that Sanguinius, universally beloved among the Primarchs and possessed of a moral authority that neither of them could match, should serve as the Imperator Regis, the Regent Emperor of this new domain. The 3 brothers divided power among themselves. Sanguinius ruled as Emperor. Guilliman became the Lord Warden, irresponsible for civil governance and administration. And Lionel Johnson was named the Lord Protector, a title that was, in all but name, the equivalent of War Master. The Lion would command the combined military forces of Imperium Secundus, directing the defense against whatever threats might emerge from the ruin storm or the galaxy beyond. It was, for a brief time, a functional arrangement. The 3 brothers balanced each other's strengths and weaknesses. Guilliman's administrative genius kept the empire running, Sanguinius's moral authority kept the peace, and the Lion's martial prowess kept them all safe. But Conrad Kersey was still aboard the Invincible Reason. During the final stages of the Thramus Crusade, Kersey had been captured, but had managed to escape his confinement. for 16 weeks. As the lion had personally hunted the Night Haunter through the vast bowels of his own flagship, stalking his brother through corridors and maintenance shafts and forgotten compartments. But the elusive Kersey had evaded capture. When the Dark Angels arrived at Macragge, the lion had kept this fact secret, not wanting to reveal to Guilliman that he had a traitor Primarch loose aboard his ship. Kersey, of course, escaped, and then all hell broke loose. The Night Haunter launched a one-man campaign of terror against Ultramar. He rampaged across Macragge, massacring civilians and Astartes alike, eluding every attempt to capture or kill him. He even managed to send a suicide bomber to destroy a strategically important bridge. And he worked with anti-Guilliman rebels in the restive Imperium region of Macragge to destabilize the new empire from within. The lion became obsessed with hunting Kers down. It was personal now, not just a strategic necessity, but a matter of honor and responsibility. It was the lion's prisoner who had escaped. It was the lion's failure that had unleashed this terror upon Macragge, and it was the lion who was going to end it. His pursuit of Kersey led him into increasingly controversial territory. When the lion became convinced that the Night Haunter was hiding in the rebellious Imperium region, he advocated using weapons of mass destruction to destroy the area from orbit. Sanguinius and Guilliman both opposed the idea, unwilling to sanction the annihilation of an entire region and its civilian population to eliminate a single target. Overruled but undeterred, the lion deployed the Dreadwing, the most feared of the Dark Angel's specialized formations. The Dreadwing was the wing dedicated to absolute, uncompromising warfare, the wing that employed weapons and tactics that other formations considered too extreme, too destructive, too close to the methods of the enemy. Under the lion's direction, the Dreadwing swept through Imperium, flush with the kind of overwhelming force that left little room for collateral damage concerns. The lion managed to corner Kers at last in the Alma Mons region. The two Primarchs fought once more, and this time the lion was decisive. He defeated Kers in single combat, breaking his back across his knee in an echo of an ancient knightly punishment, paralyzing the Night Haunter and dragging him before his brothers for judgment. But the trial of Conrad Kersey became a disaster. The Night Haunter, even chained and broken, was a master manipulator. He admitted to his crimes but refused to accept guilt, arguing that he had been created to act as he did, that his nature was the Emperor's design, and that punishing him for following that nature was hypocrisy. More damningly, he revealed that the lion had ordered secret orbital strikes on Macragge in defiance of Sanguinius's explicit commands, driving a wedge between the three brothers that could not be repaired. The aftermath was bitter. Guilliman broke the lion sword across his knee in an act of symbolic censure. Sanguinius, who had the authority of emperor, dismissed the lion from Imperium Secundus, effectively banishing him. The Dark Angels withdrew from Macragge in humiliated silence, where their Primarch's reputation tarnished and his relationship with his brothers fractured. But the story of Imperium Secundus was not yet over. Thanks to the prophetic visions of both Sanguinius and the captive Kersey, the three brothers came to realize that the Emperor still lived, that terror still stood, and that Imperium Secundus had been built on a false premise. The three agreed to dissolve their creation, to pretend it had never existed, and to lead their forces through the ruin storm in a desperate attempt to reach Terra before it was too late. The journey through the ruin storm was a nightmare. The Loyalist fleet fought through warp-spawned horrors, demonic entities, and the ruins of worlds that had been consumed by the storm's fury. At the Second Battle of Davin, the world where Horus had first fallen to chaos, as Sanguinius led the assault that broke the demonic blockade and opened a path through the storm, the three Primarchs parted ways. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels raced for Terra, arriving in time to participate in the final, desperate defense of the Imperial Palace. Guilliman and the Ultramarines followed, though they would arrive too late to prevent the worst of the siege's devastation. And the lion, burdened with grief and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that his own actions during the heresy had been less than perfect, turned his fleet toward home. toward Caliban. The fall of Caliban. What awaited the lion at Caliban was the final and most devastating betrayal of his life. As the Dark Angel's fleet emerged from the warp and entered orbit around their homeworld, they were met not with the welcome of brothers returning from war, but with a devastating barrage of planetary defense fire. The orbital weapons that the Lion himself had helped to install, the defenses that he had designed to protect Caliban from external threats, were turned against his own ships with lethal accuracy. The Lion pulled his fleet back, reeling from the shock of the attack. For a moment, he could not process what was happening. This was his world, his home, the place where he had been found and named and given a purpose, the place where he had fought his first great crusade and won his first great victory. And it was shooting at him. Information came quickly, as it always does in the aftermath of betrayal. A nearby merchant vessel confirmed what the Lion's tactical sensors were already telling him. Luther had turned. The man who had pulled the Lion from the darkness of the forest, the man who had given him his name and taught him to be human, had declared his allegiance to chaos and taken control of the planet's garrison. The Dark Angels left behind on Caliban, fed by decades of resentment and isolation, and the slow, insidious corruption of the warp energies that still lurked beneath the planet's surface, had followed Luther into rebellion. The Lion's fury was unleashed. He ordered a systematic orbital bombardment of the planet, targeting every defensive position, every rebel stronghold, every trace of the corruption that had taken root in his absence. He held nothing back. The Lion was not a man who did things by halves, and his wrath, when it finally broke through the walls of cold restraint that had contained it for centuries, was truly terrible. The planet burned. Continent by continent, the Dark Angel's bombardment reduced the surface of Caliban to a blasted wasteland. The forests that had once sheltered the great beasts, the forests where a feral child had survived alone for a decade, the forests that had given the Lion his name, were consumed by fire that fell from the sky. When the defenses were whittled down to nothing, the Lion led his forces to the surface personally. He fought his way through the ruins of the fortress monastery of the Order, the very building where Luther had first brought him out of the wild and into civilization, cutting down the Marines who stood against him with a cold efficiency that left no room for mercy or hesitation. And at last, he found Luther. Luther was barely recognizable. The Chaos Gods had elevated their champion, pouring warp energy into his enhanced body until he burned with a power that rivaled the Primarch's own. He stood in the ruins of the monastery's great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of everything they had built together, and his eyes held a light that was not entirely his own. The duel between the Lion and Luther was a cataclysm. Two beings of superhuman power, each empowered by forces beyond mortal comprehension, fighting with every weapon at their disposal in the ruins of the only home either of them had ever known. The building shook with the force of their blows. The ground cracked beneath their feet. The very air seemed to burn with the energy of their conflict. The Lion wounded Luther. Again and again, his blade found its mark, opening cuts and gashes in Luther's corrupted armor, driving him back step by step through the crumbling halls. But the Lion could not bring himself to deliver the killing blow. This was Luther. This was the man who had saved his life, who had taught him to speak, who had given him a purpose beyond survival. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the corruption and the devastation that Luther had wrought upon their world, some part of the Lion could not, would not bring himself to end the life of his oldest friend. Luther had no such restraint. With a scream of rage and despair and something that might have been love twisted beyond recognition, Luther unleashed a blast of sorcerous energy directly at the Lion. The psychic attack struck the Primarch with the force of a collapsing star, driving through his armor and into his flesh, doing damage that no conventional weapon could have achieved. The Lion fell, and in that moment, as Lionel Johnson lay broken and bleeding on the floor of the ruined monastery, Luther saw what he had done. The madness cleared, the corruption receded, and for one terrible, clear-eyed moment, Luther saw the full reality of his betrayal. He had destroyed the only man who had ever truly mattered to him. He had sold his soul for revenge against a slight that, in the cold light of this moment, seemed so small, so petty, so utterly unworthy of the price that had been paid. Luther began to weep. The sound of Luther's weeping was, perhaps, the most terrible thing the ruins of the monastery had ever heard. It was not the weeping of a man who had lost a battle. It was the weeping of a man who had lost himself, who had looked into the mirror of his own actions and seen reflected there a stranger so monstrous that he could not bear to acknowledge it as his own reflection. In that moment, all the anger and the resentment and the jealousy that had consumed Luther for decades, that had driven him from the light of the Emperor's service into the shadow of chaos, all of it burned away like morning mist in the blast of a nuclear detonation. What remained was only grief, raw and absolute, the grief of a man who had destroyed the only thing in the universe that had ever truly mattered to him. He had found the lion in the forest. He had given him a name. He had taught him to speak, to fight, to live among humans. He had stood beside him through the long crusade against the great beasts, through the coming of the Emperor, through the early years of the Great Crusade, and now, at the end of everything, in the ruins of the only home they had ever shared, Luther knelt beside the broken body of his greatest friend and wept for a crime that could never be undone. The Chaos Gods, observing the confrontation through whatever dark senses they used to monitor the affairs of mortals, were not pleased by Luther's change of heart. In a final act of spiteful rage, they unleashed a warp storm of titanic proportions upon Caliban. The planet itself began to tear apart, the accumulated corruption of millennia finally breaking through the surface and consuming everything in a maelstrom of unreality and destruction. The fallen angels, Luther's followers who had sided with chaos, were swept into the warp and scattered throughout time and space, cast to 1,000 different worlds and 1,000 different eras, each one carrying with them the shame of their betrayal. Caliban was destroyed. The world that had given birth to the lion, the world that had shaped him and named him and sent him out to conquer the stars, was gone. All that remained was a single chunk of rock, the foundation on which the fortress monastery had stood, preserved by unknown forces amid the cataclysm. This fragment would become known as the Rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels chapter. The Dark Angels descended to the ruins and found Luther, broken and mumbling, chained amid the rubble. He spoke only in fragments, over and over again, repeating that the lion had been taken, that he would return one day, that he would forgive Luther for what he had done. Of the lion himself, there was no sign. 10,000 years of silence. The greatest secret of the Dark Angels, a secret guarded more zealously than any military intelligence or strategic asset, a secret known only to the Emperor himself and the innermost circle of the chapter's leadership, was this: Lionel Johnson was not dead. In the chaos of Caliban's destruction, the lion had been spirited away by the Watchers in the Dark, those enigmatic, diminutive beings who had dwelt in the depths of Caliban's forest since before the Age of Strife. No one knew exactly what the Watchers were. They were not human. They were not alien in any conventional sense. They were something older and stranger, beings who existed at the intersection of the material world and the Imperium, who possessed knowledge and purposes that they shared with no one. The Watchers took the mortally wounded lion to a hidden chamber buried in the deepest levels of the rock, a chamber that no Dark Angel had ever seen and no scanner had ever detected. There, they placed him in stasis, healing his wounds through means that defied the understanding of even the most advanced Imperial technology. And there he remained, sleeping and healing and waiting for 10,000 years. Above him, the galaxy continued its endless cycle of war and suffering. The Imperium survived the Horus heresy, but only barely, and the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. kept alive by the constant sacrifice of 1,000 psykers a day. A living corpse whose divine will held the Imperium together through sheer force of psychic power. The great legions were broken apart during the Second Founding, divided into smaller chapters of 1,000 warriors each. The Dark Angels became a chapter, and their successor chapters became known collectively as the Unforgiven, bound together by the shared shame of Luther's betrayal and the obsessive pursuit of the fallen. For 10 millennia, the Dark Angels hunted their wayward brothers with a single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. The existence of the fallen was the chapter's darkest secret, a shame so profound that they would go to any lengths to conceal it from outsiders. If the Imperium at large ever learned that half the Dark Angels' legion had turned traitor during the Horus heresy, the consequences would be unthinkable. The chapter would be declared excommunicate traitorous, their gene seed destroyed, their names struck from the rolls of honor that they had earned through 10,000 years of faithful service. So they hunted, they interrogated, they killed, and they kept their secrets, even from each other, with the paranoid vigilance of an organization that has something truly terrible to hide. And beneath the rock, the lion slept on. He slept through the age of apostasy, when the Imperium tore itself apart in civil war. He slept through the reign of blood, when the High Lord Goj Vandir turned the ecclesiarchy into a tool of personal tyranny. He slept through 13 Black Crusades, each one bringing the forces of chaos closer to the gates of terror. He slept through the rise and fall of alien empires, through the arrival of the Tyrannid hive fleets, through the awakening of the Necrons, and through every crisis and every triumph and every slow, grinding defeat that marked the passage of 10,000 years in a galaxy that knew only war. Above him, the Dark Angels continued their work. Generations of Supreme Grand Masters came and went, each one inheriting the terrible burden of the chapter's secrets and the even more terrible burden of knowing that their Primarch lay sleeping beneath their feet. They visited the hidden chamber. They knelt before the sleeping figure of Lionel Johnson. They whispered prayers and made oaths and renewed the vow that had sustained their chapter for millennia, the vow that the fallen would be hunted, that the shame would be atoned for, that the Dark Angels would remain unforgiven until the last of Luther's corrupted followers had been brought to account. Luther himself remained chained in the deepest dungeon of the rock, guarded by the Watchers in the dark. For 10,000 years, successive Supreme Grand Masters had attempted to make him repent for his crimes, to extract from him some confession or acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. But Luther's mind had been shattered by the trauma of his betrayal and the loss of the man he had loved and destroyed. He spoke only in fragments, repeating the same words over and over, a litany of madness and guilt that never varied. He will return. The lion will return. He will forgive me. The Dark Angels did not know whether to believe this prophecy or to dismiss it as the ravings of a broken mind. They kept Luther alive because he served as a source of information about the fallen, his fractured consciousness occasionally yielding scraps of intelligence that could be used to track down the scattered traitors. But they also kept him alive because, deep down, in the secret chambers of their own hearts, they hoped that his words were true. They hoped the lion would return. They hoped he would forgive them all. He slept through the reformation of the Imperium under the returned Reboot Gilliman, who was resurrected from his own long stasis on Macragge by the techno-sorcery of the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call and the Aeldari god of the dead, Inead. He slept through the Indomitus Crusade, that vast military campaign that sought to stabilize the Imperium in the wake of the 13th Black Crusade and the birth of the Great Rift. He slept through it all, dreaming of forests that no longer existed, hunting beasts that had been dead for 10,000 years, walking through memories that faded a little more with each passing century. And then, in the 42nd millennium, in humanity's darkest hour since the heresy itself, the lion woke up. Mirror Caliban and the Forest Walk, The circumstances of Lion L. Johnson's awakening remain shrouded in mystery. Even the lion himself does not fully understand what happened or why. What is known is that he awoke not in the hidden chamber beneath the rock, or if he did, his memories of that awakening were lost. Instead, his first conscious experience after 10,000 years of sleep was of standing in a forest. But it was not a forest he recognized, and yet it was entirely familiar. Mirror Caliban. That is the name that has been given to the strange, mist-shrouded realm in which the lion found himself. It resembled the ancient forests of his homeworld with an eerie precision, the same towering trees, the same lightless canopy, the same sense of watching, predatory intelligence lurking just beyond the edge of perception. But it was not Caliban. Caliban was gone, destroyed 10 millennia ago by the forces that the lion himself had unleashed. This was something else. A reflection, a memory, a pocket dimension that existed at the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium, perhaps conjured from the lion's own subconscious as he slumbered for thousands of years. The forest never seemed to end, no matter how far the lion walked, and he was not alone. The watchers in the dark were there, moving through the undergrowth with their customary silence, watching him with their dark, inscrutable eyes. Great beasts prowled the shadows, creatures that should not have existed on any world, let alone in this impossible place. And there was another presence, a wounded king who sat beside a river, bleeding slowly from injuries that never healed, staring into space with eyes that held a knowledge he could not share. The lion had lost his memories. Not all of them, not permanently, but the 10,000 years of sleep had left gaps in his mind, blank spaces where knowledge and experience should have been. He remembered fragments, flashes of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The forests, the beasts, the nights, the wars, the betrayal. But the connections between these fragments, the emotional context that would have given them meaning, was missing, stripped away by the long sleep, like a painting whose colors have faded until only the outlines remain. As a watcher in the dark approached him, the first of many interactions that would gradually guide the lion back toward himself. The tiny figure told him that he was home, that the forest was his, that the wounded king was a mystery he was not yet ready to solve. When the lion asked what he should do, the watcher replied with cryptic simplicity, "Follow your nature." And the lion's nature was to hunt. He began to move through Mirror Caliban, following instincts that had been written into his very DNA by the Emperor's genecraft. He discovered that the forest responded to his will, or rather, that his will could influence where the forest led him. By focusing on a destination, he could cause the trees to shift and the paths to change, until the mist parted and he found himself stepping out of the forest and onto the surface of a real world, somewhere in the galaxy. This ability, which the lion came to call the Forest Walk, was unlike anything that any other Primarch possessed. It allowed him to travel vast distances without the need for ships or warp drives, stepping between worlds through the medium of Mirror Caliban, as if the boundaries between dimensions were nothing more than curtains to be pushed aside. The Forest Walk also allowed him to bring others with him, transporting companions through the interdimensional forest to emerge at destinations that no conventional means of travel could reach. The lion's first emergence from Mirror Caliban brought him to the world of Kamath, a jungle world in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy that had been cut off from the light of the Astronomicon by the Great Rift, in the massive warp storm that had torn the galaxy in two following the 13th Black Crusade. Kamath was, in many ways, similar to the Caliban of old, a heavily forested world, whose people lived under constant threat from hostile wilderness and the forces of chaos. And on Kamath, the lion found something he had not expected. He found the fallen. Specifically, he found a warrior named Zabriel, one of the Dark Angels who had been scattered through time and space during the destruction of Caliban 10,000 years ago. Zabriel was one of the fallen, those warriors whose very existence had been the Dark Angel's greatest shame for millennia. For 10,000 years, the Unforgiven had hunted the fallen with relentless determination, seeking to capture them and force them to repent their betrayal. But the lion, upon meeting Zabriel, yet did something that no supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels had ever done. He listened. He heard Zabriel's story, how he had been caught up in the confusion of the battle on Caliban, how he had never willingly turned to chaos, how he had spent centuries fighting to survive in a galaxy that considered him a traitor. And the lion, with the quiet authority of a Primarch and the hard-won wisdom of a man who had spent 10,000 years learning the cost of unforgiveness, granted Zabriel his pardon. The warrior formerly known as one of the fallen became one of the risen. This act of forgiveness, seemingly small in the context of a galaxy at war, represented a seismic shift in the culture and identity of the Dark Angels. For 10,000 years, the Unforgiven had defined themselves by their shame and their pursuit of the fallen. The lion, so with a single act of mercy, challenged the fundamental assumption on which that pursuit was based, the assumption that every fallen angel was irredeemably corrupt, that their betrayal was absolute, and their punishment was inevitable. Some of the fallen deserved no forgiveness. Some had been consumed by chaos, their loyalty to the Emperor eroded by millennia of corruption, until nothing remained but malice and spite. These, the lion dealt with in the manner he had always dealt with the enemies of mankind, swiftly, cleanly, and without remorse. But others, like Zabriel, had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been caught up in a tragedy that they did not understand, scattered by forces beyond their control, and condemned to exile by an institution that could not afford to acknowledge the possibility that not every member of its family was guilty. The lion gathered these redeemed warriors to his side and called them the Risen. Together, they began a campaign across the Imperium Nihilus, freeing world after world from the grip of chaos and Xenos threats. The lion fought as he had always fought, with cold precision and unstoppable determination. But there was something different about him now, something that the centuries of sleep and the experience of loss and the act of forgiveness had changed. He was still the lion. He was still cold, still calculating, still possessed of a strategic brilliance that could dissect a battlefield with the precision of a surgeon. But he was also, perhaps for the first time in his long existence, capable of something that he had never been capable of before. He was capable of mercy. During his wanderings in Mirror Caliban, the lion discovered two artifacts of enormous significance. The first was the power sword Fealty, a blade of elegant design and devastating potency that replaced the lion sword, which had been broken by Gilliman and was still in the possession of the enigmatic fallen, known as Cypher. The second was the Emperor's Shield, a mighty artifact that blazed with protective energy and seemed to respond to the lion's will with an intelligence of its own. The shield was found in a domed building within Mirror Caliban that the Watchers had warned the lion against entering. Naturally, the lion entered it anyway. Inside, he was confronted by a demon that could shapeshift into the forms of his brother Primarchs, forcing him to fight through a gauntlet of his own siblings' likenesses before he could claim the shield. The experience was brutal and exhausting, each false brother fighting with the techniques and the fury of the real thing. But the lion endured, and when he emerged from the building with the Emperor's shield in his hands, he was more powerful than he had ever been. Armed with Fealty and the Emperor's shield, the lion was ready to announce his return to the galaxy. The Night of Nihilus. The lion's emergence onto the galactic stage came during the Arcs of Omen campaign, a series of devastating attacks launched by the Despoiler, Abaddon, and his unlikely ally, Vashtor the Archiphane, a being of terrifying technological mastery who sought to construct a device of catastrophic power known as the Key. Vashtor had created Wormwood, and a daemon world fashioned as a blasphemous mockery of the destroyed Caliban, complete with twisted forests and corrupted cathedrals. Upon this world, the forces of the Black Legion, the World Eaters, and Vashtor's own followers gathered. pursuing their dark purpose, while the Dark Angels and their unforgiven successor chapters launched an assault to stop them. Supreme Grand Master Azrael led the Unforgiven onto the surface of Wormwood, where they found themselves facing an enemy of overwhelming strength. And then Angron arrived. The demon Primarch of Khorne, transformed by his patron god into a creature of blood and rage that barely resembled the brother the lion had once known, descended upon the Dark Angels with the fury of a berserker deity. Angron tore through the Unforgiven ranks with devastating force, his every blow crushing power armor and shattering ceramite, his every roar shaking the ground beneath the feet of the warriors who tried to stand against him. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, that ancient and honored warrior who had served the Emperor for over 1,000 years, arrived with a relief force and threw himself at Angron to buy time. Dante and his sanguinary guard fought the demon Primarch with desperate courage, but they were outmatched. Dante himself was struck down, his golden armor cracked, and his ancient body broken by the force of Angron's blows. And then, as all seemed lost, the forest came. An apparition of ancient trees materialized from nowhere, mist-shrouded and impossible, appearing on the surface of Wormwood, as if a piece of another world had been overlaid upon reality. The trees shimmered and faded, and from their depths stepped a figure that no one in the galaxy had seen for 10,000 years. Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, walked out of the forest and onto the battlefield, with the measured stride of a knight approaching the list. He carried fealty in one hand and the Emperor's shield in the other, and his eyes held the cold, calculating light of a hunter who has finally found prey worthy of his attention. He saved Dante from Angron's killing blow, and then he turned to face his corrupted brother. The duel between the lion and Angron was everything that a clash between two Primarchs should be. Angron fought with the mindless, overwhelming fury that was the hallmark of Khorne's chosen. Every blow carrying enough force to shatter mountains, every attack fueled by the infinite rage of the blood god. But the lion did not fight rage with rage. He fought rage with discipline. He fought fury with precision. He fought chaos with the cold, methodical calculation that had always been his greatest weapon. With all the hunter's cunning of a knight of Caliban, aided by the strange new abilities that had accompanied him out of his long sleep, the lion trapped Angron for the instant he needed. Using the demon Primarch's own berserker momentum against him, the lion drove the tip of fealty into Angron's throat, and then, without a shred of remorse for the creature that had once been his brother, he raised the Emperor's shield and smashed it through the demon Primarch's skull. Angron was banished, cast back into the warp, defeated not by superior firepower or divine intervention or the sacrifice of 10,000 warriors, but by the focused and disciplined skill of a single combatant who understood that the greatest weapon against chaos is not passion, but patience. The lion and his risen cleared a path for the Blood Angels and the Unforgiven to evacuate back to their ships, as Wormwood activated the key and vanished into the warp, along with Abaddon and Vashtor. The campaign was over. The Dark Angels had lost Wormwood, but they had gained something far more valuable. They had their father back. In the aftermath of the battle, Lion L. Johnson was declared the Knight of Nihilus, the champion and protector of the dark half of the galaxy. It was a title that suited him perfectly, evoking the knightly traditions of Caliban while acknowledging the grim reality of the Imperium Nihilus, or a place of darkness and danger where the light of the Astronomicon did not reach and the Emperor's protection was at its weakest. The Lion learned, through his meeting with Commander Dante, that his brother Rabut Guilliman had also returned to the galaxy, reawakened from his own long stasis and now serving as the Lord Commander of the Imperium. This revelation shocked the Lion, who had not expected to find any of his brothers still alive after 10,000 years. The knowledge that Guilliman walked the galaxy once more added a new dimension to the Lion's plans and his purpose. But the Lion did not rush to terror. He did not seek out Guilliman for a reunion. Instead, he did what he had always done, what he would always do. He went where the fighting was hardest, where the need was greatest, or where the beasts were thickest, and the darkness was deepest. He established the Lion's Protectorate, an alliance of worlds in the Imperium Nihilus that had been cut off from the greater Imperium by the Great Rift. Using his forest walk ability, the Lion traveled from world to world, appearing from the mist like a figure out of legend, cutting down the monstrous threats that besieged isolated human communities with the same cold efficiency he had once brought to the extermination of Caliban's great beasts. Worlds that had been given up for lost, communities that had resigned themselves to slow annihilation, found salvation in the form of a towering figure in knightly armor who stepped from the shadows, destroyed their tormentors, and then vanished back into the mist as suddenly as he had appeared. On each world he visited, the Lion did more than simply slay monsters. He organized defenses. He trained local militias, which he called the Lion Guard, teaching them the basic principles of defense and fortification that he had learned on Caliban and refined across 10,000 years of warfare. He established communication networks between the isolated worlds of his protectorate, creating a web of mutual support and shared intelligence that allowed them to coordinate their defenses and respond to threats more effectively than any single world could manage alone. It was, in many ways, a recreation of what he had done on Caliban in the earliest days of his life. Back then, he had united the scattered knightly orders of a feudal world into a single fighting force, capable of exterminating the great beasts. Now, he was doing the same thing on a galactic scale, uniting the scattered worlds of the Imperium Nihilus into a coalition capable of resisting the darkness that pressed in from all sides. The parallels were not lost on the Lion. He recognized in his current circumstances a mirror of his origins, and he drew strength from the recognition. He had been born into darkness. He had survived the darkness, and now, 10,000 years later, he was fighting the darkness again, with the same cold determination and the same unshakable conviction that the beasts, whatever form they took, could be defeated. The worlds of the Lion's Protectorate became islands of stability in the chaos of the Imperium Nihilus, while other regions descended into anarchy and despair, cut off from terror and the guiding light of the Astronomicon. The worlds under the Lion's protection maintained order and hope. That they were not prosperous, they were not comfortable, they were besieged and battered and constantly under threat. But they were alive, and they were free, and they knew that when the worst came, the Lion would be there. The Lion also showed a different side of himself during this period, a side that surprised even those who thought they knew him. He displayed a concern for the common people of the Imperium that went beyond strategic calculation. On the world of Avalus, which became the central hub of his protectorate, he personally oversaw the construction of defenses, walking among the civilian workers and speaking with them about their fears and their hopes and the daily challenges of survival in a galaxy gone mad. His manner was still formal, still distant, yet still touched with that characteristic coldness that had defined him since his earliest days. But there was something else there now, a recognition that the people he was fighting for were not merely resources to be protected or assets to be defended, but individuals whose lives had value in themselves. 10,000 years of sleep had changed the Lion, or perhaps it had not changed him so much as allowed him to catch up with himself. The feral child who had survived alone in the forest had learned to fight. The Knight of Caliban had learned to lead. The Primarch of the Dark Angels had learned to conquer. And now, after millennia of darkness and silence, the Lion was learning something that had eluded him for his entire existence. He was learning to care, not with the warm, effusive compassion of a Sanguinius or the paternalistic concern of a Guilliman. The Lion's caring was quiet and practical, expressed not in words, but in actions, in the walls he built, and the monsters he slew, and the worlds he refused to abandon, even when strategic logic might have dictated otherwise. It was the caring of a man who had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what connection felt like, and who was now, tentatively, carefully, with all the wariness of a wild animal approaching an offered hand, beginning to remember. Stories spread. Rumors traveled from world to world, carried by merchants and refugees, and the few astropathic messages that could penetrate the warp interference of the Great Rift. They spoke of a figure known by many names: the cowled giant, the unforgiving knight, the emperor incarnate. His arrival was always heralded by an apparition of ancient forests fading from the void, and his departure was always marked by the silence that follows the death of the last monster. The lion had come home, not to Caliban, which was gone forever, but to the role that he had been created to fill. He was the hunter, the protector, the slayer of beasts. He had been made for this purpose, and after 10,000 years of darkness, he had finally accepted that purpose as his own. On the worlds he saved, they built shrines to him. They painted his likeness on the walls of their churches and whispered his name in their prayers. They did not know who he was, not really. They did not know the name Lionel Johnson, or the title of Primarch, or the history of the Dark Angels and their terrible shame. They knew only that when the darkness came, when the monsters closed in and all hope seemed lost, a figure stepped from the shadows and fought for them, and that was enough. The legacy of the Lion. L. Johnson's story is, in many ways, the central story of Warhammer 40,000 itself. It is a story about the cost of duty, about the price that is paid by those who dedicate themselves to the defense of something greater than themselves. It is a story about the tension between the machine-like efficiency that war demands and the messy, complicated, irreducibly human qualities that make the fight worth having in the first place. The lion is not an easy character to love. He is cold where other heroes are warm. He is silent where others are eloquent. He is calculating where others are passionate. He does not make grand speeches about honor and glory and the immortal spirit of mankind. He does not rally his warriors with the force of his charisma or the power of his personality. He leads by example, by the simple, undeniable fact that he is willing to go where the fighting is worst and do what needs to be done, regardless of the cost. But that coldness, that silence, that calculating precision, these are not weaknesses. They are the armor that the lion wears over a heart that has been broken more times than any heart should have to endure. The boy who survived alone in the forest for a decade learned that vulnerability was death, and he carried that lesson with him through every subsequent trial, through the betrayal of his oldest friend, through the destruction of his homeworld, through 10,000 years of dreamless sleep in the darkness beneath the stone. What makes the lion's story compelling is not his invulnerability, but his vulnerability. It is the moments when the armor cracks, when the cold facade slips, and you glimpse the man beneath the legend. The moment when he could not bring himself to kill Luther, even though every tactical calculation demanded it. The moment when he pardoned Zabriel and created the Risen, choosing mercy over the institutional paranoia that had defined his chapter for millennia. The moment when he stepped from the forest on Wormwood, not because he had been ordered to, or because it was strategically optimal, but because people were dying and he could not stand by and watch. The lion represents something that the Imperium desperately needs, and that the grimdark setting of Warhammer 40,000 often seems designed to deny: the possibility of change. Yet the possibility that a being shaped by war and isolation and betrayal can still choose to be something more than the sum of his wounds. The possibility that 10,000 years of darkness can end, not with a whimper, but with the measured stride of a knight walking out of the forest to face whatever monster awaits. His story is far from over. Two Primarchs now walk the galaxy, the Lion and Guilliman, and the tension between their very different approaches to leadership and governance promises to shape the future of the Imperium in ways that no one can predict. Guilliman is the administrator, the builder, the man who believes that the Imperium can be reformed and improved and guided toward a better future. The Lion is the warrior, the hunter, but the man who believes that the galaxy's problems will be solved not by politics and paperwork, but by the edge of a blade applied with sufficient force to the right target. Neither is entirely wrong. Neither is entirely right. And somewhere in the space between their visions, in the tension between the pen and the sword, lies the future of humanity. So that is the story of Leon L. Johnson, the first Primarch, the son of the forest, the knight of Nihilus, a feral child who became a king, a warrior who became a legend who became a ghost, and a ghost who, when humanity's need was greatest, found his way back to the light. But perhaps what makes the Lion's story resonate so deeply is not the grand sweep of its epic battles or the cosmic significance of its political intrigue. Perhaps what makes it truly memorable is something simpler and something quieter, something that speaks to a truth that exists outside the fiction of the setting. The Lion is a story about loneliness. From the very beginning, from those first 10 years alone in the forests of Caliban, Leon L. Johnson has been fundamentally, inescapably alone. Even when surrounded by his knights, his battle brothers, his fellow Primarchs, even when standing at the heart of the greatest military machine the galaxy has ever seen, the Lion has always been isolated. His inability to understand the emotions of others, his instinct for secrecy, his deep-rooted distrust of vulnerability, all of these things have kept him at a distance from the connections that might have sustained him through the worst of what the galaxy had to offer. And yet, he fought on. He fought through the loneliness and the isolation and the crushing weight of duty that was placed upon his shoulders before he was old enough to understand what duty meant. He fought when his brothers turned traitor. He fought when his oldest friend betrayed him. He fought when his world was destroyed around him. And when he woke up 10,000 years later, alone again, in a forest that should not have existed, surrounded by shadows and monsters, and the ghosts of memories he could barely hold on to, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He started hunting. There is something deeply human about that response, something that transcends the superhuman nature of the character. When everything is taken from you, when the world you knew has been replaced by something unrecognizable, and when the people you loved are gone and the causes you served have been corrupted or forgotten, what do? You do the thing you were made to do. You put one foot in front of the other. You face the darkness. You fight. Not because you expect to win, not because you believe that fighting will bring back what you have lost, but because the alternative, to stop fighting, to give in, to let the darkness close over your head and carry you away, is simply not acceptable. Not while there are still people behind the walls, still looking out into the night, still hoping that someone, somewhere, is coming to help. The Lion is coming. He has always been coming. Since the day Luther pulled him from the forest and gave him a name and a purpose, the Lion has been coming. Through the forests of Caliban and the battlefields of the Great Crusade, on through the fire and blood of the Horus Heresy and the cold silence of 10,000 years of sleep, through the mist-shrouded pathways of Mirror Caliban and the burning worlds of the Imperium Nihilus. He is coming, and he will not stop until every beast is dead or he is. That is who the Lion is. Not a perfect hero, not a flawless leader, not an unblemished champion of all that is good and right in the galaxy. He is flawed. He is broken. He has made mistakes that cost thousands of lives and decisions that haunt him across the millennia. But he is also relentless. He is also unbreakable. He is also, in the deepest and most fundamental sense of the word, loyal. Loyal to a purpose that was written into his bones before he had words to describe it. Loyal to an ideal of service that he pursues, not because it brings him joy or recognition or reward, but because it is the only thing that makes the darkness bearable. That is the promise of the Lion. That is his legacy, not the victories or the conquests or the titles or the honors. The promise that as long as there is darkness in the galaxy, as long as there are monsters lurking beyond the firelight, as long as there are innocent people in need of protection, there will be someone willing to step into that darkness and face whatever waits there, not with the passionate fury of a berserker, or the righteous wrath of a paladin, or the cold calculations of a machine, but with the quiet, patient, implacable determination of a hunter who has spent his entire life in the forest and knows that the forest, for all its horrors, is his home. If you have made it this far, if you have walked with me through the dark forests of Caliban and across the blood-soaked battlefields of the Horus Heresy and through the mist-shrouded passages of Caliban, then you know the lion as well as any mortal can. You know his strengths and his failings, his triumphs and his tragedies, and you understand why, of all the emperor's sons, he is perhaps the one most deserving of the title he was given at his birth. The first. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps this community grow, and I am genuinely grateful for every single one of you who takes the time to listen and to share in this incredible universe. There are so many more stories to tell, and so many more legends to explore, so many more dark corners of the galaxy to illuminate. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even in the war, there are those who refuse to stop fighting for something better. The lion is one of them. And now, so are you.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.